The quiet hum of a sleeping city was broken only by the click of handcuffs. Officer Greg Miller tightened them around the wrists of a man standing calmly under the dim glow of a street lamp outside a shuttered electronics store. "You can explain it downtown," Miller said, ignoring the man's measured protests. A satisfied smirk crossed his face as he pushed his suspect toward the patrol car. The moment they walked into the precinct, however, Miller's confidence faltered. Heads turned, conversations ceased, and a palpable tension filled the air. "Uncuff him. Now!" barked the captain, his voice sharp as steel. Miller froze, his smug demeanor melting into confusion. "Meet Detective Elijah Davis," the captain continued, his tone laden with suppressed fury. "Your new commanding officer." The precinct's fluorescent lights buzzed softly, but the charged silence was deafening. Detective Elijah Davis stood tall, his broad shoulders squared, his expression unreadable. The handcuffs on his wrists gleamed like an accusation as he faced the room of stunned officers. Miller fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking as he unlocked the cuffs. Davis flexed his wrists once they were free, his composure intact but his dark eyes sharp with scrutiny. Captain Harris, a grizzled veteran with decades on the force, stepped forward. "My office. Both of you. Now." His voice left no room for debate. Miller followed reluctantly, his confusion giving way to unease. Who was this man, and why did the captain seem ready to explode? Davis walked ahead, his footsteps deliberate and heavy. As they entered the cramped office, Captain Harris shut the door with a force that made the blinds rattle. "Explain," Harris said, glaring at Miller. "I thought he looked suspicious," Miller began, his voice defensive. "He was hanging around a closed store in the middle of the night. I was just doing my job." Davis remained silent, his eyes fixed on Miller, assessing. Finally he spoke, his voice even but cold. "You didn't ask questions. You didn't verify anything. You assumed." Miller's face reddened. I thought." "You thought wrong," Harris interjected, his frustration spilling over. "Detective Davis transferred here to help clean up this precinct, and this is how you welcome him, by arresting him on nothing?" Miller's protest died in his throat. Davis, still calm, laid out the facts. "You violated several protocols, Officer Miller. Your approach wasn't just wrong, it was dangerous." The gravity of the situation began to sink in for Miller. Davis turned to Harris. "I'll let you handle the internal procedures, but I expect this to be addressed." Harris nodded grimly. "It will be." Word of the incident spread like wildfire through the precinct. Davis's arrival, already a topic of gossip, became the focal point of every whispered conversation. Some officers were appalled at Miller's mistake. Others bristled at the idea of Davis's reformist reputation. Miller himself was a mix of embarrassment and anger, stewing in the locker room as his colleagues cast him side glances. Meanwhile, Davis settled into his role with quiet efficiency. His reputation as a no-nonsense, high-performing detective preceded him, and it became clear within days that he was here to change the culture, and that he wasn't afraid to start with the hard conversations. The precinct buzzed with tension the following morning as Detective Elijah Davis called an all-hands meeting. Officers shuffled into the briefing room, their chatter subdued. Officer Greg Miller sat toward the back, arms crossed, his jaw set tight. The weight of whispers about the previous night hung heavy in the air. Davis stood at the front of the room, his presence commanding yet unpretentious. He scanned the room before speaking, his voice measured and calm. "Last night, a mistake was made," Davis began. The room stilled, every gaze fixed on him. A mistake that highlights the challenges this department faces, challenges that have gone unaddressed for too long. Though he didn't name Miller outright, the implication was clear. Miller shifted in his seat, his face burning under the indirect scrutiny. Davis continued, walking the room as he spoke. "This precinct has a responsibility to the community, to this badge, and to one another. But we cannot fulfill that responsibility without confronting our own biases and flaws. What happened last night wasn't an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a larger problem, and that problem ends here." Davis laid out his vision: stricter accountability measures, mandatory bias training, and a renewed commitment to procedural justice. He emphasized that these changes weren't about punishment, but about growth. Some officers nodded in agreement, their faces thoughtful. Others bristled, the rigidity in their postures betraying their resistance. Miller sat motionless, his gaze fixed on the floor. As the meeting adjourned, murmurs rippled through the room. Davis remained at the front, answering questions from curious or skeptical officers. Miller lingered near the exit, torn between retreating and confronting the man who had upended his routine. Finally, he approached Davis, his anger barely contained. "You humiliated me," Miller said in a low, heated tone. Davis met his gaze evenly. "Humiliation wasn't my goal. Accountability was." "You don't even know me," Miller countered, his voice rising slightly. "You just walked in here and made me an example." "And what example did you make of me last night?" Davis shot back, his tone cool but firm. "I'm not here to make enemies, Officer Miller, but I am here to make sure this badge stands for something more than unchecked authority." Their exchange drew a few sidelong glances, but Davis ended it with a curt nod, leaving Miller stewing. The precinct felt like a powder keg, but Davis carried on with his work, his unyielding focus both inspiring and unsettling. That afternoon, Davis began meeting with officers individually to discuss their roles, challenges, and expectations under his leadership. Some meetings were productive, marked by honest conversations about the department's culture and goals. Others were tense, with officers like Miller barely concealing their resentment. Yet Davis remained patient, his approach consistent: listen, challenge, and lead. Miller, meanwhile, found himself the subject of pointed discussions among his colleagues. Some sympathized with him, believing Davis was too quick to assert his authority. Others saw the incident as a much-needed wake-up call. Either way, the scrutiny weighed on Miller, feeding his resentment and self-doubt. One officer, a veteran named Rodriguez, pulled Miller aside. "You know," Rodriguez said, his voice low but firm, "you messed up, but you've got a choice now. You can dig in or you can learn." Miller scoffed. "Easy for you to say." "It's not easy," Rodriguez countered, "but it's the right thing, and maybe it's time we all start doing what's right, not what's easy." Miller didn't respond, but Rodriguez's words lingered long after the conversation ended. For the first time, a sliver of doubt crept into Miller's defenses, challenging the narrative he'd built around himself. Davis, for his part, continued to lead by example, his steady resolve creating ripples of change that Miller could no longer ignore. The atmosphere in the precinct grew more strained as Davis's reforms began to take shape. Weekly workshops on implicit bias and procedural justice were scheduled, and attendance was mandatory. Officers grumbled about the changes, the resistance palpable in roll calls and locker room conversations. Davis didn't flinch, addressing their concerns with a mixture of logic and unwavering firmness. "This isn't about politics," Davis stated in one session, standing before a room of skeptical officers. "This is about trust, trust between this department and the people we serve. Without it, the badge means nothing." For many, his words were a call to reflection. For others, like Miller, they were salt in a wound. The humiliation of being the unwitting catalyst for this upheaval gnawed at him. Every knowing glance from a colleague felt like a judgment. Every mention of accountability felt like a direct rebuke. But it wasn't just the workshops that marked a shift. Davis had introduced a new system for reviewing arrests and use of force incidents, requiring detailed justifications and supervisor oversight. The first case to undergo this scrutiny was none other than Miller's arrest of Davis. Sitting through the review board, Miller clenched his jaw as Davis, now seated across the table from him, laid out the procedural failings of the incident with clinical precision. "You ignored opportunities to de-escalate," Davis explained, his tone measured but unyielding. "You didn't verify the man's identity. You lacked probable cause. These are not just errors, they're violations of trust, and that trust is the cornerstone of our work." The board ruled the arrest improper, and Miller was issued a formal reprimand. Though it stopped short of suspension, the decision further isolated Miller among his peers. Some officers avoided him altogether, while others, particularly those more senior, saw his predicament as a cautionary tale. It wasn't long before Davis made another move that caught the precinct off guard, partnering Miller with Officer Rodriguez. The decision was strategic. Rodriguez was respected, level-headed, and known for his ability to handle tough situations. Miller, however, saw it as another calculated humiliation. "Babysitting duty, huh?" Miller muttered as they prepared for their first patrol together. Rodriguez ignored the jab. "You ready to roll?" he asked evenly, not giving Miller the satisfaction of a reaction. Their first shift together was uneventful until they responded to a noise complaint in a residential neighborhood. At the scene, they encountered a group of teenagers playing loud music on the front porch. Miller immediately stepped forward, his tone sharp. "Turn it off and clear out," he barked. The teens bristled, their body language defensive. One of them, a boy no older than 16, spoke up. "We're not doing anything wrong. We're on my property." Miller's hand drifted toward his belt, his posture rigid. "I said." Rodriguez interjected, stepping between Miller and the group. "Hey," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Let's talk about this. Can we turn the music down? Your neighbors are trying to get some rest." The teens hesitated but ultimately complied, muttering under their breath as they lowered the volume. Rodriguez nodded, thanked them, and returned to the patrol car. Miller followed, his frustration boiling over. "You undermined me back there," Miller snapped as they drove away. "No," Rodriguez replied calmly. "I de-escalated. That's the job." Miller opened his mouth to retort but found himself unable to argue. The interaction replayed in his mind throughout the night, leaving him unsettled. For the first time, he began to see a glimpse of what Davis, and now Rodriguez, was trying to teach him. He wasn't ready to admit it, not yet, but the seed had been planted. Back at the precinct, Davis monitored the shifts closely. He wasn't naive. He knew the resistance wouldn't dissipate overnight. But he also knew that change, real change, required persistence and patience. As he watched Miller and Rodriguez's partnership unfold, Davis saw potential, not just for Miller's growth, but for the precinct as a whole. Still, the road ahead was fraught with challenges, and Davis knew that the true test of his leadership was yet to come. The tension in the precinct finally boiled over one rainy afternoon. A mandatory precinct-wide meeting had been called by Davis. The topic: lessons learned from recent incidents. Officers filed into the briefing room with a mix of curiosity, skepticism, and outright defiance. Miller sat in the back, arms folded, radiating frustration. He had spent weeks partnered with Rodriguez, and while the veteran's calm demeanor was beginning to rub off on him, Miller's resentment toward Davis remained simmering beneath the surface. Davis stood at the podium, commanding the room's attention. "Today, we're going to walk through a case study," he began, clicking a remote to display an image on the projector screen. It was a still frame from Miller's body camera on the night of Davis's arrest. A murmur rippled through the room. "We've all seen this image," Davis said, his tone steady. "It represents a failure, not just of protocol, but of principles. But I'm not here to assign blame or shame. I'm here to learn with you and to make sure this doesn't happen again." Miller stiffened in his seat, his pride chafing at the indirect spotlight. Davis continued, dissecting the incident step by step. He highlighted the missed opportunities for de-escalation, the procedural oversights, and the assumptions that had driven the interaction. Yet, his tone was never accusatory, only analytical, as if peeling back layers of a puzzle to expose the truth. The room was silent, as Davis concluded. "Mistakes are inevitable. Refusing to learn from them is a choice. That's the choice we all face today." The officers sat in heavy silence, some avoiding eye contact, others nodding thoughtfully. Miller, however, felt his anger spike. He shot up from his chair, his voice sharp and loud in the still room. "So what? You think we're all just incompetent? That we don't know how to do our jobs?" All eyes turned to Miller, the air thick with tension. Davis met his glare without flinching. "I think," Davis replied evenly, "that we can always do better, including me." Miller scoffed. "Easy for you to say, standing up there with all your awards and your speeches. You don't know what it's like out there." Davis stepped out from behind the podium, his voice calm but firm. "You're right. I don't know your experiences, Officer Miller, but I do know what it's like to be judged before I even open my mouth. And I know what it's like to hold myself accountable, even when it's hard." The room was dead silent. Davis took a step closer to Miller, his voice dropping slightly, but gaining intensity. "Confidence without accountability is dangerous. You want to talk about what it's like out there? Let's talk about the people who don't trust us, who fear us, because they've seen what happens when we operate without checks." Miller's jaw clenched, his frustration warring with an uncomfortable sense of recognition. He wanted to argue, to push back, but something in Davis's words struck a chord. The confrontation set the tone for the rest of the meeting. Davis shifted focus back to solutions, unveiling plans for new community outreach initiatives and doubling down on the importance of the bias training sessions. But the tension lingered, like a storm cloud refusing to break. After the meeting, Miller stormed out of the briefing room, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. He headed for the locker room, needing space to process, but Davis followed. "Miller," Davis called, his voice steady. "We need to talk." Miller spun around, his frustration boiling over. "What do you want from me?" he demanded. "I'm not the villain here." Davis crossed his arms, his expression calm but unyielding. "I don't want anything from you, Miller. I want something for you, for all of us. I want you to see that this badge is more than just authority. It's a responsibility, one we've been failing." Miller opened his mouth to retort, but found himself at a loss for words. Davis's gaze softened slightly. "I see potential in you, Miller, but potential means nothing if you're not willing to grow." Davis left, his words hanging in the air. Miller sank onto a bench, his mind racing. For the first time, he began to wonder if Davis wasn't the enemy he had painted him to be. The precinct buzzed with subdued tension after the explosive meeting. Davis had struck a nerve, not just with Miller, but with the department as a whole. Conversations lingered in hallways and over coffee breaks, some officers openly grappling with their roles in perpetuating a flawed system, others doubling down on defensiveness. Miller, however, couldn't shake Davis's parting words. They echoed in his mind during his shifts, his meals, even in the quiet moments when he tried to unwind. "Confidence without accountability is dangerous." The phrase played like a loop, challenging his long-held beliefs about his work and his badge. Days later, Miller and Rodriguez responded to a call that would push everything to a breaking point. A domestic dispute had spilled onto the street in a busy neighborhood. A frantic woman flagged them down, pointing toward a man pacing aggressively near a row of parked cars. "He's got a gun!" she cried. Miller's adrenaline surged as he and Rodriguez approached cautiously. Miller's hand hovered over his holster, his heart pounding. The man, late 20s, wiry, his face twisted with frustration, had his hands in his jacket pockets. As the officers neared, he shouted, "Back off! I didn't do anything!" The scene was chaotic. Neighbors peered out from windows and doorways, murmuring nervously. The man's posture screamed anger, but something about his voice struck Miller, an edge of desperation rather than threat. "Hands where I can see them," Miller barked, his tone sharper than intended. The man flinched but didn't move. Rodriguez stepped in, his voice calm but firm. "We're here to help, man, but you've got to work with us. Let me see your hands, okay?" The man hesitated, his gaze darting between the officers. Miller tightened his grip on his weapon. Every instinct screamed for him to act, to assert control. But then Rodriguez's earlier words echoed in his mind. "I de-escalated. That's the job." Miller inhaled deeply. "We're not here to hurt you," he said, his tone softening. "But you've got to show us your hands. Let us figure this out together." For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The man's eyes searched Miller's face, as if weighing his sincerity. Slowly, he pulled his hands from his pockets, empty. Relief washed over Miller as the situation diffused. The man was detained without incident, and further investigation revealed that the supposed weapon was a misunderstanding fueled by panic. Back at the precinct, word of the incident spread quickly. Rodriguez, ever pragmatic, recounted the events during the debrief, emphasizing the importance of their calm approach. For Miller, the experience was a revelation. He couldn't ignore the shift in his mindset or the role Davis's influence had played in it. Later that evening, Davis found Miller sitting alone at his desk, reviewing the incident report. Without preamble, Davis sat across from him. "I heard about the call," Davis said. "You did good work out there." Miller looked up, his expression conflicted. "I just didn't want to make things worse." "That's what this is all about," Davis replied. "Every decision we make out there has a ripple effect. You saw that today." Miller hesitated, then spoke, his voice quieter than usual. "You were right, about the badge, about accountability. I think I've been so caught up in trying to prove myself that I lost sight of what this job is supposed to mean." Davis leaned forward slightly, his tone softening. "Admitting that takes courage. Growth doesn't happen without it." For the first time, Miller allowed himself to see Davis not as an adversary, but as a mentor. The tension between them didn't vanish overnight, but the walls Miller had built began to crumble. The precinct itself began to shift, too. Davis's reforms, once met with resistance, gained traction as officers saw the results in the community. Calls became less contentious, trust between officers and residents began to rebuild, and even the most skeptical officers started to reconsider their stances. Miller, once a symbol of resistance, found himself quietly embracing the changes he had fought so hard against. The storm had passed, but its impact would shape the precinct, and Miller, forever. In the weeks that followed the domestic dispute call, a quiet transformation began to take root in the precinct. Officer Miller, once a bastion of stubborn pride, found himself reevaluating his approach to policing. Partnering with Rodriguez had forced him to confront his reflexive behaviors, and Davis's steady leadership continued to challenge his beliefs about authority and trust. Miller's demeanor on calls shifted noticeably. His sharp edges softened, and his focus turned toward listening and understanding. It didn't go unnoticed. Residents who had once bristled at his presence began responding with less hostility, and even his colleagues commented on the change. "Looks like someone's been drinking the Kool-Aid," one officer joked during a briefing, nodding toward Miller after he shared an unusually empathetic report on a noise complaint. Miller rolled his eyes, but didn't react. He'd grown accustomed to the teasing, knowing it came from those still resistant to the changes Davis had implemented. But even their barbs seemed less biting than before, as if the precinct itself was taking tentative steps toward unity. Davis, meanwhile, continued to lead with quiet determination. His reforms, once viewed as intrusive, had begun to yield tangible results. Complaints against officers decreased, response times improved, and the precinct's reputation among the community started to mend. Davis's focus wasn't just on policing better, it was on policing with purpose. One afternoon, Davis stopped by Miller's desk unannounced. "Got a minute?" he asked. Miller glanced up from his paperwork, nodding. The two men walked to Davis's office, the tension that had once defined their interactions replaced by something closer to mutual respect. "I've been reviewing your recent reports," Davis began, taking a seat across from Miller. "You've been handling things differently. I see the effort, and I appreciate it." Miller shifted in his seat, unaccustomed to direct praise. "Just trying to do the job right," he muttered. Davis gave a small smile. "It shows, but I need you to do more than just the job. Officers look up to you, Miller. Whether you realize it or not, you set an example. I want you to help me lead." Miller blinked, caught off guard. "Me? Lead? Why not?" Davis leaned forward. "You've already started. Change doesn't come from the top alone. It needs voices from within. People trust you, even those who resist me." Miller hesitated. The weight of the request was heavy, but Davis's belief in him was undeniable. "I'll think about it," he said finally. "That's all I ask," Davis replied, standing. "Think about the kind of leader you want to be." That evening, as Miller walked to his car, he found Rodriguez leaning against the hood of his patrol vehicle, sipping coffee. "You look like a man with something on his mind," Rodriguez said, smirking. "Davis wants me to step up," Miller admitted, leaning against the car beside him. "Be some kind of example for the precinct." Rodriguez nodded, taking another sip. "Makes sense. You've got their ear more than you think." "I don't know if I'm cut out for it," Miller confessed. "I'm still figuring this stuff out myself." "Leadership isn't about having all the answers," Rodriguez said. "It's about doing the right thing, even when it's hard. You've started doing that. The rest will follow." Miller frowned, considering the words. He thought about Davis, about the mistakes he'd made, about the lessons he'd learned the hard way. For the first time, the idea of leading didn't feel impossible. It felt necessary. The next day, Miller took a small but significant step. During a routine roll call, he spoke up, supporting one of Davis's new initiatives to increase community outreach. It wasn't much, just a few sentences, but the effect was immediate. Officers who had been on the fence about the reforms glanced his way, their expressions shifting from skepticism to consideration. Davis caught his eye after the meeting, giving him a small nod of approval. Miller returned it, a silent acknowledgement of the path he was beginning to walk. The precinct wasn't transformed overnight, but the cracks in its old foundation were beginning to show. Through those cracks, something new and better was taking root. And for the first time, Miller felt like he was part of the solution rather than the problem. Weeks turned into months, and the precinct began to show undeniable signs of transformation. Davis's reforms, once met with skepticism and outright resistance, were now yielding tangible results. Community complaints about officer misconduct had dropped significantly, and trust between the precinct and the neighborhood slowly began to rebuild. Officers, too, started embracing the changes, recognizing the benefits of a culture that emphasized integrity and fairness. For Miller, the shift was personal as well as professional. Partnering with Rodriguez had taught him the value of restraint and empathy, and Davis's leadership had shown him what accountability truly meant. Though he hadn't fully embraced the mantle of leadership Davis had offered, Miller found himself stepping into the role naturally. Younger officers began seeking his advice, and his peers treated him with newfound respect, not out of fear or authority, but because they saw the genuine effort he was making to improve. One day, the precinct hosted its first community outreach event under Davis's command. The goal was to bring officers and residents together, fostering understanding and collaboration. The station parking lot buzzed with activity. Tables of food, games for kids, and information booths about safety programs lined the space. Officers mingled with the community, many of them nervous at first, but soon finding common ground in casual conversations. Miller stood near the edge of the event, watching the interactions unfold. He noticed a boy tossing a football with one of the officers, one of the same kids who had been involved in the noise complaint he and Rodriguez had handled weeks earlier. The boy waved at him, and Miller hesitated before waving back, a small smile tugging at his lips. "You look like a man who's starting to believe," a familiar voice said. Miller turned to see Davis standing beside him, arms crossed, his expression warm but serious. "Believe in what?" Miller asked. "That this can work, that we can be better." Miller nodded slowly. "I do. It's not easy, though." "Nothing worth doing ever is," Davis replied. He looked at Miller for a long moment before adding, "You've done good work, Miller, but I need to know, are you ready to do more?" Miller hesitated, the weight of the question settling on him. For months he had resisted change, fought against Davis, and doubted his own capacity to grow. Now, he saw the change in himself, in the precinct, and in the community. The choice felt clear. "I am," Miller said finally. Davis extended his hand, and Miller shook it firmly, a silent agreement between two men who had started as adversaries and become allies. As the event wound down, Davis took the stage to address the crowd. He spoke about the importance of trust and collaboration, about the precinct's renewed commitment to serving with integrity. His words resonated, drawing applause from both officers and residents. At the edge of the crowd, Miller watched, his posture more relaxed than it had been in months. A boy approached him, one of the neighborhood kids he'd often seen hanging around the streets. "Officer Miller," the boy said shyly. "You're not so bad." Miller crouched to meet the boy's gaze. "Thanks, kid. I'll try to keep it that way." The boy grinned and ran off, leaving Miller with a quiet sense of pride. Months later, the precinct was unrecognizable from the place Davis had first stepped into. The culture had shifted, and while not every officer had fully embraced the changes, most had at least begun to see their value. Davis's leadership had proven its worth, and Miller had grown into one of his strongest advocates. One evening, Miller knocked on Davis's office door, a file in hand. Davis looked up, his expression curious. "Got a proposal for a new community program," Miller said. "Something to keep the kids out of trouble. Thought you might want to take a look." Davis took the file, scanning it briefly before smiling. "This is good. Really good." Miller shrugged. "Figured it was time I stopped just talking about change and started making it." Davis stood and extended his hand again. "Welcome to leadership." Miller shook it, feeling for the first time that he truly belonged in this new chapter of the precinct's story. The story closed with a new tradition, an annual community police barbecue, this time led by Davis and organized by Miller. As neighbors and officers laughed and shared meals together, the rift that had once divided them felt a little smaller. Miller stood on the outskirts, watching Davis work the crowd, his own expression softer now, the hint of a smile tugging at his lips. The badge hadn't changed. but the people wearing it had. And for Miller, that was enough.